Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going on a seriously fascinating journey to uncover the shocking 17th century origins of the economic systems that govern our modern lives. We're going to look at a single entity that basically wrote the rulebook for global trade, corporate finance, and massive-scale enterprises. But as you'll see, while they were building this modern financial machine, they were simultaneously writing a very dark chapter in human history.
When you think about the nuts and bolts of our modern economy, Wall Street, your 401k, the massive mega corporations that produce our tech and our food, where do you think it all started? You'd probably picture 19th century industrial barons, right? Or maybe the 20th century tech booms. But to find the true ancestor of all these deeply familiar, everyday concepts, we actually have to rewind way back to the year 1602 in the Dutch Republic.
So picture this. In August of 1602, the Dutch East India Company, widely known as the VOC, held what we would call today an initial public offering, or IPO. And it was a massive success. They raised an absolutely unprecedented 6.4 million guilders. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. But what made this truly revolutionary was who was actually participating. This wasn't just funded by royalty or a handful of ultra-wealthy merchants. Over 1,000 everyday investors, 1,143 to be exact, stepped up to buy shares. This move made it the world's first publicly traded company and literally gave birth to the retail investor. Okay, let's dive into how this actually worked because it was a total game changer. Before the VOC, the old way of doing business in the East Indies was entirely temporary. Merchants would pool their money together just to fund a single voyage. When the ships came back, they sold the cargo, liquidated the capital, paid out the profits, and that was that. But the VOC flipped the script completely. They introduced a groundbreaking innovation, permanent capital. Instead of just funding a single trip, investors locked their money into the company indefinitely. Now, what's really interesting about this structure is how that permanent capital gave them a massive edge. Because their funding was locked in, they didn't have to wait around to raise new funds for every single trip. This allowed the VOC to finance and maintain an impressively consistent, permanent Asian fleet. Their main rivals, the English East India Company, were still operating on that old short-term capital model for decades, meaning the English ships had to constantly sail back and forth. The VOC, meanwhile, maintained a constant, highly armed presence right in the heart of the trading zones. But wait. Locking in this capital indefinitely created a pretty immediate problem for the investors. How on earth do you ever get your money back? Well, the VOC's charter had a brilliant solution that essentially invented modern finance. It was called transferability. If you wanted out, you couldn't just withdraw your funds from the company's vault. Instead, you had to sell your shares to a willing buyer. This invention of exit via sale absolutely required a secondary market. So it literally birthed the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's very first formal stock market. This brings us to an absolutely crucial concept, limited liability. It is a foundational DNA-level feature of modern business. For the VOC, this meant that investors were legally protected from losing any more money than what they initially put in. Think about it. If the company went bankrupt, creditors couldn't suddenly come after a shareholder's personal house or life savings. Over time, this protection was even extended to the managing directors. Now, this shielded individuals from corporate debts, but critically, it also shielded them from legal accountability for the company's actions overseas. Of course, locking up everyone's money wasn't exactly smooth sailing, which brings us to our first dose of real Wall Street drama. Enter Isaac Le Maire. He was a major VOC shareholder and actually a former director who had been ousted. Well, by 1609, he was incredibly frustrated with how the company was being run. He filed a formal petition complaining about poor corporate governance, outright stating that the directors were trying to retain people's money for longer than agreed upon and using it in ways the shareholders didn't want. Today, this is celebrated as history's very first recorded instance of shareholder activism. But Le Maire didn't just write a sternly worded letter, he took ruthless financial action. He orchestrated what we'd now call a bear raid. Here's how he did it. First, he formed a secret syndicate called the Groot Company. Second, he engaged in massive short selling, meaning he sold borrowed VOC shares for future delivery, betting the price would drop. And third, to guarantee the price dropped, he and his syndicate spread vicious rumors about catastrophic shipwrecks and military losses. He effectively became history's first recorded short seller, deliberately trying to drive the stock price down just to force management's hand. Fast forward a bit to 1622. The VOC's original charter was up for renewal, and disgruntled investors waged an absolute pamphlet war. And their demands sound incredibly modern. We're talking shareholder voting rights, independent auditing of the company's books, approval rights before the company could take on debt, and even the regulation of insider trading. And guess what? It worked. They successfully pressured the government into creating a supervisory board of 9 shareholders. They literally invented the concept of modern corporate governance. Now, as incredibly sophisticated as this whole financial machine was over in Amsterdam, we have to execute a hard pivot here and look at the horrifying reality it was actually funding on the other side of the world. Jan Pieterszoon Koen, a notoriously ruthless VOC governor general, wrote to his directors in 1614 with a very chilling summary. He said, "We cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade." The dark truth of the matter is that this brilliant economic blueprint was entirely fueled by a sovereign corporate military. It is genuinely jarring to contrast these sterile financial terms we've been talking about, things like permanent capital, liquid secondary markets, and limited liability, with the brutal reality on the ground. You see, the VOC's charter allowed it to act as a quasi-sovereign state. This wasn't just a business. This company negotiated treaties, maintained a private army of nearly 10,000 mercenaries, built heavily armed fortifications, and utilized extreme judicial violence to enforce its monopolies. A prime example is the infamous Amboina massacre in 1623, where they tortured and executed rival English merchants. And nowhere was this absolute brutality more clear than in the Banda Islands. The Bondanese people refused to grant the VOC an exclusive monopoly on the sale of nutmeg and mace. So, in response, between 1609 and 1621, the VOC launched a systematic campaign of conquest. Through direct massacres and orchestrated naval blockades that caused widespread famine, the VOC killed approximately 2,800 Bondanese people. And why? Simply for refusing a corporate monopoly.
The devastation of the Banda Islands was just near total. Following the massacres and the engineered starvation, the VOC rounded up 1,700 survivors. These men, women, and children were immediately enslaved by the company.
To replace the very native population they had just decimated, the VOC established what was called the Perkiner system. This was a brutal, completely coercive agro-industrial plantation system. The nutmeg plantations were owned directly by the VOC. They were managed by Dutch overseers known as Perkiners, and they were worked entirely by enslaved laborers forcefully brought in from other regions. This entire system was designed with one singular chilling goal: enforcing an absolute global monopoly on nutmeg to maximize those shareholder dividends back in Amsterdam. The sheer scale of human exploitation required to run this vast corporate empire is just staggering. Over its 2-century lifespan, the VOC and its private employees engaged in massive, multi-directional human trafficking. It's estimated that they shipped between 660,000 and 1.1 million enslaved Africans and Asians all across the Indian Ocean. They were forced to build fortifications, maintain shipyards, and work those agricultural plantations. And this, right here, reveals the bitter, bitter irony at the heart of the entire system. That exact same limited liability clause that we celebrated earlier, the very one that protected the shareholders' personal wealth and allowed the stock market to flourish, also completely divorced those exact same investors from any moral or legal accountability. The shareholders back in Amsterdam were legally insulated from the war, the massacres, and the massive slave trade that their locked-in permanent capital was out there funding. Ultimately, the Dutch East India Company went bankrupt and was dissolved by 1799, but its corporate DNA entirely survived. I mean, it gave us the stock market, corporate governance, and limited liability, literally the building blocks of the modern global economy. But when we look at the massive, powerful megacorporations of today, it leaves us with a really provocative question to think about. While we have definitely outlawed the private armies and sovereign conquests of the VOC, have our modern corporate structures truly escaped the blueprint of unaccountable power drawn up all the way back in 1602? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.